I know it sounds crazy. Who would believe that my brother, the man who taught me to ride a bike, who shared a room with me, could push our mother and me into the freezing shark-infested sea with the intention of watching us drown? But it happened. And as I swallowed salt water, fighting against the waves that wanted to drag me to the bottom, I felt my mother's hand grip my wrist with a strength I didn't know she still possessed. I heard my mother Claudia's trembling voice whispering in my ear, "Don't swim, Jorge. Pretend to drown." Henry was still up there watching. My brother. The man I had defended my entire life, whom I carried on my shoulders when we were kids, now watched me drown with the coldness of someone watching a boring movie on TV. Beside him, Ava held her cell phone, not to call for help, to film. The muffled sound of their voices reached me through the water, laughter. They were laughing as I died. But my body obeyed instinct even before my brain fully processed it. I relaxed my muscles. I let my head fall back. I closed my eyes and floated like a corpse as the sound of the engine grew more and more distant. But while pretending to be dead, a question hammered in my mind. How did my mother know exactly what to do? How was she already prepared for this? The answer would come in a few hours, and it would be much worse than any drowning. My name is Noah, and for 45 years I believed I knew my family. I believed in the stories we told each other, in the traditions we kept alive, in the secrets I thought we shared. But as I floated in those icy waters, pretending to be dead, I began to realize that my entire life had been built on carefully crafted lies. Our house was at the end of a dead-end street, surrounded by centuries-old oak trees that our father James had planted when he married our mother Emma. The smell of cinnamon and apple always permeated the kitchen on Sundays, when my mother prepared her famous pie that brought the whole family together around the time-worn wooden table. Sophia's laughter echoed through the hallways like music, while Henry and I pretended to fight over the last piece of dessert. I remember staying up late just to help my mother hang clothes on the clothesline on stuffy nights. It wasn't necessary, but I wanted to be close. Sometimes she would forget the time and stand admiring the moon while humming a forgotten melody. I wondered what she was thinking in that silence, looking at the sky as if waiting for an answer. Today, I suspect she always knew more than she said. When my father got sick, I was the one who took him to appointments. When he died, I was the one who held my mother's hand during the funeral. She cried only once that day, and even then silently. I didn't protect her out of duty. It was out of love, out of gratitude, because she was all that remained of our origin, of what was once a family. My father worked as an accountant in a small company in town. We weren't rich, but we never lacked anything. My mother took care of the three of us with a dedication that bordered on sacrifice, sewing our clothes, mending our broken toys, drying our tears with the same care she used to heal our scraped knees. She had the gift of turning our simple house into a place where any problem from the outside world seemed smaller. Sophia was the youngest, 8 years younger than me and 10 years younger than Henry. Her blonde hair was always messy, no matter how much my mother tried to comb it. She collected colored stones she found in the yard and arranged them in small glass jars that shone like treasures when sunlight hit them. On Sundays, she would sit on my father's lap while he read the newspaper, asking questions about everything she saw written, even if she couldn't read properly. Henry was always different. Even as a child, there was something in his eyes that bothered me, a calculating coldness that contrasted with the spontaneity of the rest of the family. He didn't play. He planned. He didn't dream. He schemed. When we got the same toy for Christmas, Henry soon figured out a way to negotiate to get mine too. My mother thought he was just smart. My father said he had an instinct for business. I was the protector, the middle child who always tried to keep the peace, who shared my lunch when Sophia forgot hers, who lent my money when Henry urgently needed something. I grew up believing that protecting my family was my purpose in life. I never imagined that one day I would need to protect it from one of its own members. The first cracks in our family harmony began when my father died. A sudden heart attack at 52 while mowing the lawn in the backyard. My mother found him collapsed next to the still-running mower, the smell of gasoline mixed with the perfume of the flowers he loved to grow so much. The funeral was small, intimate, but the pain we felt was enormous. After my father's death, Henry began to show his true nature more openly. He pressured my mother to sell some old furniture that was good for nothing, suggested that the house was too big for just 3 people, constantly commented on the waste of keeping so many empty rooms. My mother resisted, but I could see the weariness in her eyes, the way she gave in a little more with each conversation. Sophia, then 15, began to notice the changes too. She questioned why Henry always talked about money, why he rummaged through my father's papers when my mother wasn't home, why he asked strange questions about life insurance and inheritances. Her natural innocence captured nuances that we, adults, preferred to ignore. I worked as a high school history teacher and lived just 2 blocks from home. I went there almost every day after work, helping my mother with heavy tasks, talking to Sophia about school and boyfriends, trying to keep alive the feeling of family we had before my father's death. Henry showed up on weekends, always in a hurry, always with some new idea on how to optimize our mother's life. For years I lived with the feeling that something was wrong, but I couldn't define exactly what. It was like smelling a strange odor in the house without being able to locate its origin. Henry was my brother, after all. We shared the same blood, the same childhood memories, the same love for our family. How could I suspect that behind his calculating eyes hid something much darker? The answer came 10 years ago, on an autumn afternoon when the leaves of my father's oak trees began to turn golden. Sophia had discovered something that changed everything forever, something that Henry couldn't allow to be revealed. 10 years ago, Sophia was 25 years old and worked as a nurse at the municipal hospital. She had graduated 2 years earlier and lived in a small apartment near work, but she still spent weekends at home, helping my mother with household chores and keeping alive the tradition of Sunday lunches. Her blonde hair was now always tied in a professional bun, but her eyes retained the same childish curiosity that made her question everything around her. Henry, at 35, had established himself as a real estate broker and boasted a success that seemed impressive to outsiders. He drove an imported car, wore expensive suits, and constantly talked about his big deals. He had moved to an apartment in the city center, but his visits to the house became more frequent after my father's death, always accompanied by suggestions about renovations, sales, and smart investments. I continued to live 2 blocks away, teaching history and taking care of my mother whenever possible. At 40, I had become accustomed to the role of mediator between Henry and the rest of the family, trying to soften his more aggressive approaches to financial matters while protecting my mother from unnecessary pressures. Saturday morning, October 19th, began like any other. The sun filtered through the yellowed curtains of the kitchen as my mother prepared pancakes for breakfast. Sophia had arrived the night before, bringing flowers from the hospital that a patient had given her. The sweet aroma of the flowers mixed with the smell of melted butter, creating an atmosphere of domestic peace that completely masked the tragedy that was approaching. Henry arrived around 10 in the morning, earlier than usual. His eyes had an intensity I didn't recognize, a kind of nervous urgency that contrasted with his usual calculating calm. He greeted everyone quickly and soon began talking about an unmissable opportunity for investment that would require quick and courageous decisions. Sophia listened to him with an increasingly skeptical expression. During lunch, she asked direct questions that clearly irritated Henry. What exactly were the details of this investment? Why the rush? Who else was involved? Henry responded with evasions and changes of subject, but Sophia insisted with the tenacity of someone who was used to dealing with evasive doctors at the hospital. The tension reached its peak when my mother casually mentioned that she had found some of my father's papers in the garage, bank, and insurance documents that she didn't understand very well. Henry immediately offered to organize everything, but Sophia suggested that it would be better to take the papers to an independent accountant to ensure that my mother was not harmed by some technical detail. The look Henry gave Sophia at that moment was icy. It wasn't common anger, it was something much more dangerous. The look of someone who perceived a real threat to their plans. After lunch, Henry suggested a walk to the cliff that was a few kilometers from our house. It was a place we often went to as children, a high point from where you could see the whole city and the sea in the distance. My mother declined, saying that her legs could no longer handle long walks. I had some papers to grade and also stayed home. Henry and Sophia went alone. Sophia returned 2 hours later, but not alone. She came in the police car, wrapped in a gray blanket, her eyes red from crying. Henry walked behind the car, appearing to be in shock, his clothes dirty with dirt and dry leaves. The police officer explained that Sophia had suffered an accidental fall from the cliff. Henry said that she was taking pictures of the landscape when she tripped on a loose stone and lost her balance. He tried to hold her, but couldn't reach her in time. The fall was not immediately fatal. Sophia had been found conscious, but with serious internal injuries that led to her death 3 hours later in the hospital where she herself worked. During the wake, I watched Henry with an attention I had never given him before. His behavior was strange for someone in mourning. He cried at the right time, said the appropriate words, but there was something rehearsed in his reactions. It was like watching a competent actor playing a role, but with small flaws in the performance that only someone who knew him intimately could perceive. My mother was devastated. Losing a husband had already been terrible. Losing a daughter just 3 years later almost completely destroyed her. She isolated herself for months, refusing visits and rarely leaving the house. I went there every day, trying to keep her fed and medicated, while Henry appeared sporadically with more suggestions on how to simplify her life. It was only 6 months after Sophia's death that I began to truly suspect. I found my mother crying in the kitchen, holding a letter that Sophia had written to her just a week before the accident. In the letter, Sophia mentioned that she had discovered something worrying about the family's finances and that she intended to talk seriously with Henry about the matter. When I asked my mother about this discovery, she hesitated for a long time before answering. Finally, in a trembling voice, she confessed that she had seen Henry and Sophia arguing intensely on the cliff shortly before the fall. She had decided to follow them, worried about the tension she perceived between the two. From afar, she had witnessed a heated argument, but couldn't hear the words. When she saw Sophia fall, her first reaction was to scream, but Henry hadn't heard her due to the distance and the noise of the wind. For 10 years, my mother carried this information alone, fearing that her suspicions were just paranoia from a grieving woman. But now, floating in those cold waters and pretending to be dead, I finally understood the truth. Henry hadn't just pushed Sophia off that cliff. He had killed our sister to protect a secret she had discovered. And now, he was trying to do the same thing to us. During the 5 years that followed Sophia's death, Henry transformed into a different man. Or maybe he had always been like that, and I just didn't want to see it. His visits became more frequent, but also more calculated. He always arrived with expensive gifts for my mother. French perfumes, delicate jewelry, exotic flowers. But each gift came with a conversation about financial security and planning for the future. My mother, still weakened by the loss of Sophia, began to give in to Henry's pressures, with an ease that alarmed me. She sold some family antiques that he considered without practical use, transferred her savings to a joint account for security, signed papers that she barely understood, trusting Henry's word that everything was for her own good. I tried to intervene, but Henry had developed an impressive ability to make me look like the paranoid and controlling brother. When I questioned his decisions, he responded with seemingly logical arguments about inflation, investments, and asset protection. When I insisted on seeing the documents, he was offended by my lack of trust and reminded my mother of how I had always been overly protective since childhood. That's when Ava came into the picture. Henry met her at a real estate convention and married her after only 8 months of dating. Ava was a beautiful woman, 10 years younger than Henry, with chestnut hair always impeccably styled and a smile that looked like it came straight out of a toothpaste commercial. She worked as a financial consultant and talked about money with the same ease that other people talk about the weather. During the marriage, I watched Ava with growing curiosity. She was charming with my mother, always complimenting her cooking and asking about family recipes. But there was something rehearsed in her kindness, a performative quality that reminded me of Henry's behavior at Sophia's funeral. It was as if she was playing the role of the perfect daughter-in-law, but with small slips that revealed her true nature. The couple moved into an impressive house in an upscale neighborhood in the city. Henry now drove an even more expensive car and wore watches that cost more than my annual salary. When we asked about this sudden prosperity, he responded vaguely about smart investments and opportunities he knew how to seize at the right moment. Ava complemented these explanations with technical details about the financial market that sounded convincing to those who didn't understand the subject. She talked about stocks, bonds, and investment funds with an authority that impressed my mother and made my concerns seem like financial ignorance. But I started to notice inconsistencies. Henry mentioned clients and deals that didn't match the information I could verify. Ava talked about investment strategies that, when I researched them later, turned out to be impractical or even illegal. Gradually, I realized that all that prosperity was a carefully constructed facade. The first real confirmation of my suspicions came accidentally. I was at the bank paying some bills when I recognized Henry in the next line. He was clearly nervous, arguing in a low voice with the manager about a loan that had been denied. I managed to hear fragments of the conversation. Temporary situation, assets and investments, just a matter of liquidity. The manager, visibly uncomfortable, mentioned default and compromised credit history. When Henry saw me, his expression changed instantly. The nervousness gave way to his usual confident smile, and he greeted me as if he was the happiest person in the world to see me. He made up a story about diversifying investments and quickly changed the subject to ask about my mother. That night I couldn't sleep. The pieces of a terrible puzzle were starting to fit together. Henry's sudden prosperity, his insistence on controlling my mother's finances, Sophia's convenient death shortly after she discovered something worrying about the family money. Everything pointed to a conclusion that I didn't want to accept. My brother was a con artist who was stealing from our own mother. I decided to investigate on my own. Using my high school contacts, I got information about Henry's company. I discovered that it had only been registered for 2 years, with no significant business history. His big deals were actually small transactions that barely covered his personal expenses. The luxurious house was financed with a loan he struggled to pay, and the expensive car was being repossessed by the bank. Ava wasn't who she pretended to be either. Her background in financial consulting was real, but she had been fired from her last job for inappropriate conduct involving the irregular handling of client funds. The couple wasn't prosperous. They were desperately in debt and using my mother as a source of funding to maintain their lives. When I confronted Henry with this information, he denied everything with a calmness that scared me. He said I was misinformed and that my amateur investigations were based on gossip and misunderstandings. Ava supported him with tears in her eyes, saying she was hurt that I thought so badly of them. Together, they managed to make me look like the villain of the story. But it was then that I realized something even more sinister. During our discussion, Henry casually mentioned that my mother had made a new will, leaving everything to him and Ava, because they are younger and able to properly manage the assets. When I asked about my share of the inheritance, he smiled coldly and said that I had always been very independent and didn't need financial help from the family. That night, I visited my mother and asked directly about the will. She confirmed that Henry had suggested the change, explaining that it would be more practical to leave everything centralized in his hands. She seemed genuinely convinced that she was making the right decision, repeating Henry's arguments about fiscal responsibility and asset protection. That's when I understood the real dimension of the plan. Henry wasn't just stealing money from my mother. He was setting the stage for something much bigger. With Sophia dead and me excluded from the inheritance, he would be the sole beneficiary when my mother died. And considering his willingness to push people off cliffs, I doubted he intended to wait for a natural death. From that moment on, every visit from Henry and Ava to our house became a tense vigil. I paid attention to every word, every gesture, every look exchanged between them. My mother, unaware of the danger, continued to welcome them with affection, offering her pies and telling childhood stories that they pretended to find interesting. But I knew it was only a matter of time. Henry had killed once to protect his scheme, and he wouldn't hesitate to kill again to complete it. The only question that remained was when and how he planned to execute his second and third eliminations. The answer came 3 months later, in the form of a seemingly innocent invitation for a boat trip. The invitation arrived on a Thursday in March, when winter was finally giving way to a timid spring that brought the scent of flowers in the gardens and the promise of longer days. Henry showed up at my mother's house unannounced, as had become his custom, bringing a bouquet of red roses and a smile that seemed even more forced than usual. Ava accompanied him, wearing a light blue dress that highlighted her eyes and carrying a basket with expensive wines and imported cheeses. They behaved like a couple celebrating something special, but they didn't immediately explain the reason for the visit. Instead, they insisted on preparing an elaborate dinner for my mother, transforming our simple kitchen into a scene of forced celebration. During the meal, Henry announced that he had finally closed the deal of the century and wanted to celebrate with the family. He spoke vaguely about an investment in a marina that had yielded extraordinary profits, allowing him to buy a new boat. Ava complimented the story with technical details about boats and nautical tourism that sounded impressive to those unfamiliar with the subject. The invitation arose naturally in the conversation, as if it were a spontaneous idea. Henry suggested that we spend the next Saturday sailing along the coast, enjoying the new boat and the pleasant weather that was forecast. It would be a perfect opportunity to bring the family together, remember good times, and look to the future with renewed optimism. My mother was delighted with the idea. She hadn't sailed in years since before my father's death, and the prospect of a day at sea made her genuinely excited. Her eyes sparkled for the first time in months as she talked about how good it would be to feel the sea breeze again and see the dolphins that used to appear near the coast during the spring. I hesitated. Every instinct I possessed screamed that this was a trap, but I couldn't identify exactly what Henry's plan would be. Boating in broad daylight with other sailors nearby didn't seem like the ideal setting for a crime. Maybe I was being overly paranoid. Maybe Henry really just wanted to celebrate some legitimate financial success. But it was Ava's insistence that definitely aroused my suspicions. She addressed me specifically, saying that it would be essential for me to participate because the family needs to be together in moments of joy. There was something in the way she pronounced the word essential that sounded more like a threat than a loving invitation. Henry reinforced the invitation with subtle but constant pressure. He mentioned that he had already booked a restaurant at the marina for lunch, that he had invited a professional photographer to record the moment, that it would be a terrible shame if someone missed such a special celebration. Each argument was logically convincing, but the whole thing created a sense of obligation that made me uncomfortable. My mother, noticing my hesitation, looked at me with those tired eyes that carried 10 years of mourning and asked me directly to accompany them. How could I deny her? How could I explain that I suspected my own brother was planning to kill her without sounding completely crazy? I accepted the invitation, but I immediately started planning a way to protect myself. If Henry was really setting something up, I needed to be prepared. That same night, I bought a small, waterproof cell phone, the kind used by professional divers. I tested its recording capability and confirmed that it worked perfectly even when wet. During the days leading up to the trip, I watched Henry and Ava with renewed attention. They visited my mother twice, always bringing gifts and maintaining a lively conversation about the wonderful plans they had for the future. Henry mentioned several times that they intended to travel more, perhaps buy a vacation home, invest in new businesses that would require flexibility and adequate resources. Ava complimented these conversations with seemingly innocent comments about life insurance, inheritances, and the importance of keeping documents up to date. She constantly praised my mother's wisdom for having organized everything so well with the new will, and suggested that it would be prudent to do a complete review of all policies and investments. On Friday night, Henry called to confirm the details of the trip. His voice sounded strangely excited, almost euphoric, as if he were looking forward to something far beyond a simple day of sailing. He mentioned that we would leave early, around 8 in the morning, to enjoy the best part of the day, and that we would return in the late afternoon. When I asked about the specific itinerary, Henry was vaguely evasive. He said he knew spectacular places along the coast, secluded spots where we could anchor and enjoy the tranquility of the sea. Ava added that she had prepared a special surprise for my mother, something that would be revealed during the trip. That night, I couldn't sleep. Lying in bed, I analyzed every possible scenario, trying to anticipate what Henry might be planning. A boating accident would be difficult to investigate, especially if there were no witnesses. Bodies that disappeared at sea might never be found. And with my mother and me dead, Henry would inherit everything without question. I prepared my small cell phone, programming it to start recording with a simple touch. I hid it in an inside pocket of my sailing jacket, where it would be safe even if I fell into the water. If something happened to us, at least there would be evidence of what had really occurred. On Saturday morning, I woke up before dawn with a knot in my stomach that mixed anxiety and determination. I looked out the window and saw a perfect day dawning. Cloudless blue sky, calm sea, gentle wind. The kind of day that would normally fill me with joy, but that now seemed sinister in its perfection. Henry and Ava arrived promptly at 8 o'clock, driving a new pickup truck that I had never seen before. The vehicle had a large body and was equipped with fishing and navigation equipment that seemed too professional for a casual outing. Ava carried a heavy backpack that she kept carefully closed, refusing help when I offered to carry it. My mother was radiant, wearing a floral dress that she had saved especially for special occasions. She brought a bag with homemade sandwiches and a thermos of coffee, insisting on contributing to the picnic at sea, even though Henry had said that everything was already provided. During the drive to the marina, I maintained a seemingly normal conversation while watching Henry's every move in the rearview mirror. His hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel, and he constantly checked his watch, as if he were following a specific schedule. Ava kept the backpack on her lap, hugging it as if it contained something extremely valuable or dangerous. When we arrived at the marina, I saw the boat for the first time. It was an impressive vessel, much larger and more expensive than anything Henry could legitimately buy. It had a closed cabin, sophisticated navigation equipment, and a powerful engine capable of taking us far from the coast in a short time. Henry helped us on board with exaggerated kindness, offering his arm to my mother and constantly checking if we were comfortable. Ava took control of the cabin, demonstrating a knowledge of navigation that she had not mentioned before. In a few minutes, we were sailing out to sea, leaving the safety of the coast behind. That's when I discreetly activated the recording on my cell phone and prepared to find out exactly what my brother was planning to do to us in those deep, isolated waters. The boat cut through the water with a deceptive smoothness, taking us further and further away from the safe coast. The sound of the engine muffled our conversation, but I could feel the growing tension in the air, like the atmospheric pressure that precedes a storm. My mother was sitting on the bow, her face turned to the morning sun, completely oblivious to the approaching danger. Her gray hair danced in the sea wind as she smiled with a genuine joy that I hadn't seen in years. Henry was piloting with mechanical movements, constantly checking a GPS that showed our position getting further and further from land. Ava stayed beside him, whispering instructions that I couldn't fully hear, but included words like depth and currents. The mysterious backpack was now open at her feet, revealing ropes, small anchors, and what looked like a professional camera. After 40 minutes of sailing, Henry slowed down and finally stopped the engine. We were in open sea, with no visible boats on the horizon. The sudden silence was unsettling, broken only by the gentle sound of waves hitting the hull and the distant cry of seagulls that seemed to warn us to turn back. "This is the perfect place," Henry announced, his voice sounding forcedly cheerful. "Here we can relax without being bothered by other boaters." Ava stood up and began removing equipment from the backpack with precise, rehearsed movements. First, the professional camera, which she carefully adjusted to capture the entire deck area. Then, the ropes, which she organized into small bundles. Lastly, 2 life jackets that appeared to have been altered in some way. "How beautiful," exclaimed my mother, observing the endless sea around us. "It's been so long since I've felt so at peace." Henry exchanged a meaningful look with Ava. It was then that I realized my mother had just spoken her own farewell words without knowing it. "Let's take some pictures to capture this special moment," Ava suggested, raising the camera. "How about you two position yourselves there on the side of the boat? The light is perfect." My mother stood up cheerfully, walking towards the edge. I followed her, but kept enough distance to react quickly if needed. My cell phone was recording inside my jacket, capturing every word, every movement. "Closer to the edge," Ava instructed, adjusting the camera's focus. "That way I can capture the sea in the background." That's when Henry positioned himself behind us. I felt his presence before I even saw him, a chilling sensation that ran down my spine. When I turned slightly, I saw that he had gotten close enough to reach us with a quick movement. "Smile," said Ava, preparing to take the picture, but her expression wasn't that of someone capturing a happy moment. It was cold, calculating, like a ghoul watching its prey. Henry placed his hands on our backs, supposedly to position us better for the photo, but the pressure of his fingers was too firm, too purposeful. My mother, trusting, didn't even notice. I mentally prepared myself for what was about to happen. "This will be your last photo," Henry whispered, so low that only I could hear. The push came explosively and coordinated. Henry threw us off the boat with a brutal force that sent my mother straight into the water. I managed to react partially, grabbing onto the side of the boat for a few seconds before he hit my hand with a fishing rod, forcing me to let go. The water was ice cold, a shock that burned my lungs and temporarily paralyzed my muscles. The salty taste invaded my mouth as I struggled to keep my head above the surface. The sound of the boat's engine grew more and more distant, but I could still hear Henry and Ava's voices. "We did it," Ava shouted, her voice filled with a sinister joy. "We finally did it." "Film a little more," Henry replied. "We need to make sure they really drown before we leave." That's when I felt my mother's hand grab my wrist underwater. She swam beside me with surprising energy for a woman her age, but her face showed a determination I had never seen before. Her lips came close to my ear, and she whispered the words that changed everything. "Don't swim. Pretend to drown." I obeyed instinctively, relaxing my muscles and letting my body float like a dead weight. My mother did the same, and together we drifted on the surface like two corpses swaying gently in the waves. I kept my eyes slightly ajar, just enough to see the boat stopped a few yards away. Henry and Ava watched us with binoculars, filming our supposed death with the professional camera. After about 10 minutes that felt like hours, I heard Henry shout, "It's done. They're dead." The sound of the engine came back to life, and the boat began to move away. But before they disappeared completely, I heard Henry make a phone call. His voice carried on the wind to us. "Yeah, we did it. The insurance can be claimed on Monday." "No, there's no way to trace it back to us. It looked like a perfect accident." "Yes, we'll finally have access to everything." When the boat finally disappeared over the horizon, my mother and I hugged in the water, shivering from cold and shock. But there was something in her eyes that went beyond the fear of death. There was relief, as if a terrible weight had finally been lifted from her shoulders. "I knew this day would come," she whispered, her voice almost inaudible over the sound of the waves. "I've been waiting 10 years for this." "How did you know?" I asked, barely able to form the words through my cold, numb lips. "Because I saw Henry push Sophia off that cliff," she replied, and her words fell on me like stones. "I saw everything, and ever since then, I've been living in fear that he would kill us too." The truth struck my mind like lightning. My mother wasn't an innocent victim who had been deceived by Henry. She was a survivor who had spent an entire decade waiting and preparing for this moment. She knew Henry was a murderer, and she had feigned ignorance to protect herself until she found a way to expose him. Floating in those deep waters, I finally understood that we weren't just victims of an attempted murder. We were witnesses to a confession that Henry had just made without knowing we were alive to hear it. And thanks to my cell phone still recording inside my waterproof jacket, we had evidence that would finally put my brother behind bars. But first, we needed to survive long enough to tell our story. Hypothermia began to attack our bodies after the first hour floating in the sea. My fingers were numb, my lips were blue, and I felt the muscles in my legs gradually failing. My mother, despite being over 70 years old, showed impressive resistance, as if decades of accumulated fear had strengthened her determination to survive. She held my arm tightly, keeping us together as the current slowly carried us towards a busier shipping lane. "Save your energy," she whispered through chattering teeth. "Someone will find us. I'm sure of it." As if her words had invoked a miracle, the sound of a boat engine approached. It was a fishing vessel, with 3 men who initially mistook us for debris floating in the water. When they realized we were people, they quickly changed direction and rescued us with efficient movements of those accustomed to maritime emergencies. "My God, you're freezing!" exclaimed the captain, a bearded man of about 50. "How long have you been in the water?" "Our boat sank," I lied, following a warning look from my mother. "We managed to jump out in time, but we lost everything." The fishermen wrapped us in thermal blankets and immediately called the Coast Guard. During the ride back to port, I kept my cell phone hidden inside my wet jacket, praying that the recording had withstood the salt water. My mother remained silent, but I noticed that her eyes were alert, calculating our next moves. The ambulance was waiting for us on the dock. The paramedics examined us quickly and decided that we needed hospital observation due to hypothermia and shock. During the ride to the hospital, my mother squeezed my hand and whispered, "When we get there, we need to pretend to be unconscious. It's our only chance to hear them confess." At the hospital, we were taken to adjacent rooms in the emergency ward. The doctors confirmed mild hypothermia, but nothing that put our lives at risk. They connected us to heated IVs and heart monitors, then left us to rest. Following my mother's plan, I kept my eyes closed and my breathing regular, pretending to be in a deep sleep induced by trauma. It wasn't long before Henry and Ava arrived. I heard their voices in the hallway before they even entered the room, talking in low tones with a nurse about our terrible accident. The performance of mourning they put on was impressive. Henry sobbed controllably while Ava held tissues against her red eyes. "How are they?" Henry asked the nurse, his voice trembling with emotion. Stable, but still unconscious due to shock and hypothermia, the nurse replied. The doctors believe the recovery will be complete, but it may take a few hours for them to fully awaken. Can we stay with them? Ava asked. We don't want them to wake up alone after something so traumatic. The nurse agreed and left, leaving us alone with our supposed murderers. For about 10 minutes, Henry and Ava maintained the act, whispering caring words and touching our hands like worried relatives. But gradually, as they became convinced that we were truly unconscious, their masks began to slip. Are you sure they're really out? Ava whispered, her voice completely losing its sympathetic tone. The doctor said so, Henry replied. And look at the monitors. Stable heart rates, deep breathing. They're out cold. There was a long pause, during which I felt Henry approach my bed. He stood beside me for almost a minute, probably watching my face for signs of consciousness. I kept my expression completely relaxed, focusing on breathing regularly and deeply. It worked perfectly, Henry said, finally moving away. When the police investigate, they'll find evidence that the boat had mechanical problems. The insurance will pay without question. What about the will? Ava asked. It's all taken care of. With Noah out of the picture and Emma dependent on me for everything, I can speed up the process. In 6 months, maybe less, we'll have full access to all the assets. Including the house? Ava insisted. Especially the house. That land is worth a fortune with the real estate speculation in the region. We'll get at least $2 million just from the sale. Ava laughed softly, a chilling sound that made me realize how deeply calculating she was. And to think we almost got caught 10 years ago because of that idiot Sophia. Sophia was always too smart for her own good, Henry agreed. Good thing I managed to solve that problem before she ruined everything. Do you think anyone will suspect it was the same thing? Ava asked, with genuine concern in her voice. Impossible. A cliff accident and a shipwreck, completely different. Besides, I have a perfect alibi for today. I'm here at the hospital, consoling the victims of a nautical tragedy. They continued talking for another 15 minutes, revealing details about how they had sabotaged the boat to create evidence of mechanical failure, how they had planned the timing to coincide with a storm predicted for later in the day, and how they intended to use the insurance money and inheritance to pay off their debts and start over in another state. Throughout the conversation, a nurse named Patricia was working quietly at the nursing station outside. I had noticed her presence when we arrived, but Henry and Ava apparently didn't realize she was there. Patricia was an attentive woman, around 40 years old, who clearly had experience in detecting when something wasn't right with the relatives of patients. When Henry and Ava left to get coffee, Patricia discreetly entered the room. She approached my bed and whispered, I know you're awake. I heard everything they said. I carefully opened my eyes and found her watching me with a serious but supportive expression. They tried to kill you, didn't they? She asked in a low voice. I confirmed with a nod. Patricia glanced quickly at the hallway to make sure we were alone, then continued. I've been a nurse for 20 years. I know how to recognize suspicious behavior. Those two were celebrating, not mourning, and I heard when the man mentioned killing someone named Sophia. Can you help us? I whispered. I'm already helping. I recorded their conversation on my cell phone. She replied, discreetly showing the device. And I'm calling the police right now. My mother also opened her eyes at that moment, confirming that she had heard everything. Patricia quickly explained to us that she would maintain our charade of unconsciousness until the police arrived, and that she would make sure to be present when Henry and Ava were confronted with the evidence. When I heard the police sirens approaching the hospital, I felt a mixture of relief and justice that I had waited 10 years to experience. Henry had finally confessed, not knowing that his own words would become the rope that would hang him. The truth about Sophia, about the financial thefts, about the attempted murder, everything would be revealed. And this time, there would be no way for Henry to escape the consequences of his actions. The arrival of the police transformed the hospital into a controlled whirlwind of activity. I kept my eyes closed as I listened to the heavy footsteps of the investigators through the hallways, their voices low but urgent as Patricia filled them in on the situation. When the detectives entered our room, my mother and I continued to feign unconsciousness, awaiting the right moment for our theatrical recovery. Detective Marcus Rivera, a man in his late 40s with graying hair and piercing eyes, took command of the operation. He discreetly positioned recording equipment in the room and instructed Patricia to keep Henry and Ava occupied until everything was ready. The nurse played her role perfectly, informing the couple that our condition had stabilized and that they could return to our bedsides. When Henry and Ava returned, carrying cups of coffee and wearing their masks of bereaved relatives, they had no idea that every word was being recorded by the police. They positioned themselves between our beds, whispering comments about our slow recovery and speculating about possible after effects from the accident. It was then that Detective Rivera entered the room, introducing himself as the lead investigator on the boating accident case. Henry and Ava greeted him with appropriate concern, offering to cooperate with any necessary investigation. "Actually," Rivera said calmly, "we'd like to clarify a few points about what happened today. Were you on the boat when the accident occurred?" No, Henry replied quickly. "We dropped them off at the marina this morning. They went out for a romantic ride alone. It's something they do often." The lie was fluid, well rehearsed. Ava supplemented with details about how it had been my mother's idea to take the trip, how we had insisted on going alone despite their cautious advice. Rivera listened patiently, taking notes and allowing them to elaborate on their fabricated version of events. After about 10 minutes of false testimony, he paused and looked directly at Henry. "That's interesting," the detective said, "because we have evidence that suggests a very different version of events." The change in Henry's expression was subtle but noticeable. His eyes narrowed slightly and his posture became more rigid. Ava maintained her composure, but I began to perceive a growing tension in her movements. "What kind of evidence?" Henry asked, trying to sound casually curious. Rivera smiled coldly. "First, we have the testimony of the fishermen who rescued you. They described in detail the boat you were piloting, a model and color that exactly matched the vessel registered in your name, Mr. Henry." "That's impossible," Ava protested. "We weren't there." "Second," Rivera continued, ignoring the interruption, "we have some very interesting audio recordings that were made during the incident. It was at that moment that I slowly opened my eyes, pretending to regain consciousness. I groaned softly and tried to sit up, creating the illusion that I was naturally awakening from a state of shock. My mother did the same a few seconds later, completing our coordinated performance. "Noah! Emma!" Henry exclaimed, rushing towards us with exaggerated concern. "Thank God you're all right." I looked at him with an expression of calculated confusion, as if trying to process traumatic events. "Henry, what happened? Why are we in the hospital?" "You were in a boating accident," Ava explained, holding my mother's hand with false tenderness. "You were rescued by fishermen. Don't you remember anything?" I exchanged a glance with my mother, pretending to gradually recover fragments of memory. "I remember the boat, the water, but I can't understand how we fell." It was then that Rivera intervened again. "Actually, Mr. Noah, we would very much like to hear your version of events, especially since we have reason to believe that what happened today was not an accident." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Henry and Ava exchanged a quick glance, a silent communication laden with barely disguised panic. "What do you mean, not an accident?" Henry asked, his voice betraying a slight tremor. Rivera approached and activated a digital recorder. "Because we have evidence that you two deliberately pushed Mr. Noah and Mrs. Emma into the water, with the intention of killing them." The silence that followed was deafening. I could see Henry rapidly calculating his options, his brain working furiously to find a way out. Ava remained motionless, like an animal frozen in headlights. "That's absurd," Henry finally exploded. "Who would make such a ridiculous accusation against their own family?" "You would," Rivera replied calmly. He then played the recording that Patricia had made of their conversation in the room, amplifying their own words confessing to Sophia's murder and detailing the plan to kill us. The effect was devastating. As their own voices filled the room, talking about insurance, inheritances, and eliminating problems, Henry and Ava's faces became progressively paler. When the recording reached the part where Henry admitted to pushing Sophia off the cliff, my mother began to cry silently, not from sadness, but from relief. "Furthermore," Rivera continued, "Mr. Noah managed to record part of today's events on his personal cell phone. We have clear audio of you threatening the victims before pushing them into the water." I carefully removed the cell phone from my jacket and handed it to the detective. Despite spending hours in salt water, the waterproof device had worked perfectly, preserving clear evidence of our attempted murder. Henry made one last desperate attempt to deny everything, claiming that the recordings were faked, that there were misunderstandings in their words. Ava tried a different approach, blaming Henry for everything and claiming that she had been coerced into participating. But the evidence was irrefutable, and their contradictory stories only confirmed their guilt. The two were arrested right there in the hospital, handcuffed and led away in police custody while a crowd of staff and patients watched in silence. As they were being taken away, Henry looked at me one last time, and I saw in his eyes not remorse, but anger at being discovered. The trial took place 8 months later. The evidence presented included not only our recordings, but also a detailed financial investigation that revealed years of fraud, forged documents, and systematic theft of my mother's assets. The exhumation of Sophia's body revealed injuries consistent with a violent push, not an accidental fall. Henry was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. Ava received 25 years for complicity and financial fraud. During the trial, they tried to blame each other, destroying any pretense of solidarity they might have maintained. The last time I saw them, during the sentencing, Henry seemed to have aged a decade. His elegant clothes had been replaced by the orange prison uniform, and his arrogance had given way to bitter resignation. Ava was crying uncontrollably, finally understanding the real consequences of her choices. 2 years later, my mother and I found ourselves in a situation we had never imagined, rebuilding our lives without the weight of the fear we had carried for a decade. We used part of the recovered inheritance to create a fund in Sophia's memory, dedicated to helping young nurses in their professional education. My mother, now 74 years old, has started to smile genuinely again. She maintains a garden where she plants the same flowers that my father used to grow, and sometimes I find colored stones carefully arranged among the plants, a silent tribute to the daughter we lost. On weekends we still get together for Sunday lunches, but now it's just the two of us. We prepare Sophia's favorite recipes and tell stories about her, keeping her memory alive in a healthy and loving way. The table feels smaller without Henry, but it also feels safer, more genuine. Sometimes, when the afternoon sun hits the kitchen in the same way it did 20 years ago, I can almost hear Sophia's laughter echoing through the halls again. But now I know that she can rest in peace, knowing that justice has finally been served and that her family is safe. The truth, as horrible as it was, set us free. And for the first time in 10 years, we can look to the future without fear of what our own blood might do to us.